He was referring to the congressional disclosures about CIA assassination plots. But the fact that the Navy had been operating along lines similar to the CIA was not known to the public, nor has it subsequently been admitted. The details of the story that Lieutenant Commander Nerut related have been strongly and categorically denied in all subsequent queries of the Navy. So, looking back, there's a variety of interesting things in the Nerut story. Some of this we're not going to have time to cash in on tonight in terms of bringing up supporting documentation that goes with it. But the ascending series of desensitizations. Now, you notice in this there isn't even any mention of use of drugs or anything else. So this is either possibly a different type of training, or it's possible that those details were omitted, or that's a later stage of conditioning, or something like that. It's possible, as they mentioned, that this Dr. Nerut did not have need-to-know authority to see the whole operation all the way through. Anyway, it touches on some other interesting things that we've seen in other places that we may have time to talk about later on.
Again, the processes involved here are very, very common processes, which anybody who's ever studied psychology in any university in the United States would be familiar with. First of all, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory is something which probably a lot of you have taken. It's a very commonly used test, and it's administered in institutions of all kinds, okay? The desensitization process, audiovisual desensitization, is also, as indicated, a very, very common technique. There's been a lot of research in classical psychology tests about eliminating phobias using that precise technique. Well, in this case, in a sense, a phobia, namely the phobia of extreme physical violence, is what is being removed. Note also that the people are already inclined in that direction, the people selected as candidates for this thing. I think it's also worth noting that despite what I think one could regard as the pro forma denials of the Navy, the source for this information is the London Times. It's one of the most respected newspapers in the world. It's also quite conservative. Many people think, for example, the New York Times, which has a liberal reputation, the London Times is a pretty conservative and very respectable newspaper, so this is not National Enquirer affair. And Nerut's story, by the way, has been printed in a lot of other publications. Now, keep in mind that Delgado's work, for example, was funded by the Office of Naval Research. It's again, not only was the CIA involved in developing mind control techniques, and specifically mind control techniques to perform assassination, but the military as well. And keep all of that in front of you. You know, remember all of that as we go through this, and again, go back and put some of these details together. But as with RHIC, in which the commonly used technique of post-hypnotic blocking, the technique of conditioning, in this case, a Pavlovian conditioning was used. Operant conditioning can also be used in certain methods of having people commit assassination. The difference between those can be discussed during the phone-in session if you'd like. But again, the techniques that are involved here are very, very common and would certainly be familiar to anyone with even a relatively elementary knowledge of academic psychology. Now, keep in mind Lincoln Lawrence's account, basically, of mind control being used in the assassination of President Kennedy. We're going to go back to a CIA assassin. Now, we're going to read you an entire chapter from Bowert's book, and this is almost certainly the most detailed and complete account of the functioning of a mind control assassin ever presented. And because of that, we're going to read you the entire chapter unedited so that basically you'll have all of the information at your disposal and can go back and check it out. And I think, again, the time during which mind control has been in effect is worth taking note of here. The techniques which we were talking about with RHIC EDOM were fully operational by the mid-1960s. Mind control zombie couriers were testified, their existence circa World War II was testified by William Stevenson, a very high-ranking British intelligence agent, in fact, in charge of all British intelligence in the Americas during World War II. So keep in mind, now the fellow we're going to be talking about here, a fellow named Luis Angel Castillo, was basically the events we're about to describe here, or rather that Bowert relates in Operation Mind Control, occurred in 1967, okay, almost 20 years ago. And note the degree of sophistication here in the conditioning. Now, Bowert titles this chapter The Four Faces of a Zombie, and it begins, on March 2nd, 1967, 24-year-old Luis Angel Castillo was arrested by the Philippine National Bureau of Investigation, the NBI, on suspicion of conspiring to assassinate President Ferdinand Marcos in Manila. In a series of interrogation sessions, the NBI and the Philippine Army investigators gave him truth serum at his request and put him under hypnosis. During one of these sessions, Castillo revealed that he had been involved in an assassination 4 years earlier. Castillo told the NBI, both under hypnosis and truth serum, and also in a normal state, that he had been hypno-programmed to kill a man riding in an open car. Although Castillo did not know the identity of his target, the scene of his supposed hit was in Dallas, Texas. The date was November 22nd, 1963. After revealing this information, Castillo asked for political asylum in Manila. He was quoted in the Manila Times as saying, quote, "I'm afraid to go anywhere anyway. I am as good as dead now," unquote. "I don't know how I got into Dallas and how I got out," Castillo told reporters, "but I am sure I did not carry a gun." The Manila Times story reported that Castillo had arrived in Manila carrying a Philippine passport which identified him as Antonio Reyes Eloriaga, Eloriaga, a returning resident who had been expelled from America for overstaying his visa and stealing a car. Castillo, by the way, is Castillo. While in the U.S., Castillo had traveled under the aliases Angelo Rodriguez, Razo Hernandez, Mario Rodriguez, Ignacio Gonzalez, Gradieda, and Antonio Eloriaga. Castillo told investigators that a woman with a German accent, a Mrs. Krebs, had given him his initial instructions in Dallas. According to Castillo, she was just one of many individuals who worked on him to place him in a deep hypnotic trance for the Kennedy job. Castillo said that he had been a private in the Cuban militia, the Segunda Organización Defensiva in Santiago, Cuba, when he was initially chosen for training in espionage work. He was subsequently trained for the Defensiva under a Colonel Calma, C-A-L-M-A, at a camp located about 15 miles from the Bay of Pigs. Among the members of the training cadre, Castillo said, were a communications expert named Karnovsky, along with some other Cubans and a handful of Americans. One American he identified was James Smith, who attended to Castillo's needs both as a civilian in Cuba and later in the United States. 3 years later, on October 2nd, 1966, Castillo was arrested in New Mexico and charged with driving without a proper auto registration. His arrest was made under the Eloriaga identity. Castillo was brought before New Mexico Justice of the Peace Elmer Bassett and sentenced to 4 days in jail. "The reason I gave him a jail sentence," Bassett said, "was I figured when a fellow has a hard time remembering what his name is, there's something wrong with him," unquote. After serving his sentence, Castillo was turned over to U.S. immigration authorities because he had no proof of U.S. citizenship. Bassett reported that, quote, "Castillo said he was from Madison, Wisconsin, but was born in the Philippines. He couldn't show that he was from the Philippines or that he wasn't," unquote. Bassett also revealed that someone had called him a few hours after Castillo had appeared before him and asked that the man be released, unquote. "I don't know who it was," Bassett said. "I just told him I couldn't do that," unquote. And Nip Tuck will continue with the Castillo story.
According to the NBI, which again is the Philippine Bureau of Investigation, the Filipino FBI, Castillo had Antonio Eloriaga's Philippine passport on his person when he was arrested in Manila. Based on information provided by the Intelligence Service of the Philippine Armed Forces, the NBI had been searching for him since February. They had evidence that Castillo, in the guise of Eloriaga, had made contact with a guerrilla group that was constantly plotting to assassinate Marcos and overthrow the Philippine government. The NBI set to work grilling their captured suspect. They knew something of his criminal past. They knew, for example, that he had been arrested in 1962 for carrying a concealed weapon. They also knew that 2 years later he had been sentenced to a state reformatory in Bordentown, New Jersey for larceny. But nothing prepared them for the shocking story implicating him in the events of Dallas. They asked Castillo to submit to a lie detector test and were surprised when he said that he preferred truth serum. Suspicious of both his strange story and his behavior, NBI officials called in a psychiatrist to examine him. But even after the psychiatrist judged Castillo normal, the NBI investigators still refused to take Castillo's bizarre and contradictory story at face value. Later, reporters connected with the Manila Times were equally dumbfounded by Castillo's strange behavior. One reporter described him as, quote, a now talkative, now reticent cloak and dagger man. He clammed up when he was asked whether he was in the Philippines to help implement an assassination plot against President Marcos. In his truth serum statement, he claimed he had worked with a, quote, cell of Reds, unquote, to end someone's life. But during his interview with the press, he said, quote, neither do I admit or deny it. When quizzed about Lee Harvey Oswald, he drew a blank. As a member of the Warren Commission, Gerald Ford was queried by the Philippine authorities about Castillo's revelations concerning the JFK assassination. Ford said that he would not comment on the Castillo story until he had more information. A spokesman for the Dallas Police Department said that they had no record on Castillo. Nevertheless, the U.S. Embassy did agree to a closed-door meeting between embassy officials and NBI Director Serafin Fausto on the subject of Castillo. After the meeting, Fausto refused to comment further on the story, but he did tell reporters that, quote, although publication of the story has prejudiced investigation of the case, one good thing has come out of it. Needed information is coming in from the United States to shed light on the case. Fausto also made it clear that leads obtained from the U.S. Embassy justified continuing the investigation of Castillo's link to the assassination of President Kennedy. After making an official request for assistance from the FBI, the NBI clamped a news blackout on the story, and nothing further was published in the press. Private investigations later revealed that Castillo was spirited out of the Philippines, but not before a series of hypnotic sessions had taken place at the request of the FBI. The FBI wanted to have Castillo, while under hypnosis, place the time of the Kennedy assassination. They wanted to know when Castillo had come to Dallas, what time he arrived at the building, and from what location he was supposed to shoot. They wanted to know the time he left the building, the names of any people involved, and any information by which might indicate how the plot was hatched and by whom. It came as a surprise to the NBI that the FBI also wanted Castillo questioned about the Boyeros Airport, 8 miles south of Havana, Cuba. The FBI requested that the tightest possible security be kept on any testimony obtained from the hypnotic sessions. In the last of 3 sessions requested by the FBI, Castillo was induced into deep hypnotic trance by the ordinary talking method in an NBI interrogation room in Manila. While in that trance state, he was questioned for more than 3½ hours. Now, Dave will continue.